Imagine staring into a void so black it feels heavy, standing on the steel deck of a warship slicing through the South Pacific at 20 knots, knowing that somewhere in that darkness a fleet of seasoned killers is hunting you. It is October of 1942, and the United States Navy is bleeding. The waters around Guadalcanal have already swallowed so much American steel and so many American sailors that the area is earning a grim new moniker, Ironbottom Sound. Every night, the Imperial Japanese Navy owns the dark, running high-speed reinforcement convoys down a geographical corridor known as the Slot, a relentless nocturnal supply line the Americans call the Tokyo Express. The Japanese call it rat transportation, but there is nothing timid about it. They are bringing down crack infantry, artillery, and enough high-explosive naval shells to turn the American airstrip on Guadalcanal into a lunar landscape. The United States Navy has to stop them, but doing so means facing the Japanese in night combat, a domain where the Imperial Navy has already proven itself terrifyingly superior. Have you ever tried to coordinate a multi-ship maneuver in pitch darkness without secure voice radios, while enemy torpedoes that you cannot see are already in the water? That is the tactical nightmare we are tearing apart today. Welcome to our deep dive into the Battle of Cape Esperance, the night America finally set an ambush for the Tokyo Express and proved that the Japanese were not invincible in the dark. If you are serious about military history, if you want to understand the grim mechanics of naval strategy, logistics, and the brutal reality of ship-to-ship combat, you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join the ranks of those who study war, not as a movie, but as a ruthless science. To understand why the waters of Guadalcanal became the ultimate proving ground for naval supremacy, we have to rewind the clock far beyond the outbreak of World War II. We have to look at the strategic roots planted decades earlier, specifically in the aftermath of the First World War. In 1922, the major naval powers gathered and signed the Washington Naval Treaty, an arms control agreement designed to prevent a ruinous global dreadnought building race. The treaty established a strict tonnage ratio for capital ships, allocating 5 tons for the United States and Great Britain for every 3 tons allowed to the Empire of Japan. This 5-to-5-to-3 ratio was viewed in Tokyo as a national humiliation, a deliberate Western attempt to permanently cap Japanese power in the Pacific. But the Japanese High Command did not just complain, they adapted with ruthless efficiency. They knew they could not outbuild the industrial juggernaut of the United States, so they decided they would outfight them, specifically by developing qualitative superiority in areas the Americans were ignoring. If the United States Navy was building a doctrine around massive, decisive daylight battleship engagements, heavily influenced by the theories of Alfred Thayer Mahan, the Japanese would master the art of the night strike. They poured immense resources into night fighting tactics, subjecting their sailors to training regimens so brutal and realistic that ships frequently collided and men died in peacetime exercises. They developed the finest night optics in the world, massive binoculars mounted on stabilized platforms that allowed their lookouts to spot an enemy ship in the dark at ranges that seemed physically impossible to Western navies. But seeing the enemy was only half the equation. The Japanese needed a weapon that could reach out and kill an American battle line before the sun came up, and before the American heavy guns could reply. This requirement birthed the most devastating naval weapon of its era, the Type 93 torpedo, known to history as the Long Lance. We need to pause and look at the hard data on this weapon, because the Long Lance was not just a torpedo, It was a paradigm shift in naval warfare. While American torpedoes of the time, like the notoriously defective Mark 15, were powered by compressed air, left a highly visible wake of bubbles, and had a maximum effective range of maybe 6 to 8 miles, the Japanese engineers did something incredibly dangerous and brilliant. They fueled the Type 93 with pure oxygen. This eliminated the trail of nitrogen bubbles, making the torpedo practically invisible in the water, a true stealth weapon. It was a monster, measuring 24 inches in diameter, over 29 feet long, and packing a devastating 1,080-pound high-explosive warhead. But the most terrifying metric was its range. The Long Lance could travel 22 miles at a blistering speed of 48 knots. Let that sink in for a moment. A Japanese cruiser could launch a spread of these weapons from far beyond the visual horizon, turn around, and be steaming away before the torpedoes even struck the American line. This was the technological surprise waiting for the United States Navy when the Guadalcanal campaign kicked off in August of 1942. And the Americans paid the tuition for this lesson in blood at the Battle of Savo Island on the night of August 8th and 9th. In a textbook night attack, Japanese Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa slipped into Ironbottom Sound and slaughtered an Allied cruiser force, sinking 4 heavy cruisers and killing over 1,000 sailors in a matter of minutes, while suffering almost no damage in return. Savo Island was a catastrophic tactical defeat, and it left a deep psychological scar on the United States Navy. It proved that in the dark, the Japanese were apex predators. This is the historical precedent we must keep in mind, much like how the British Royal Navy felt in the War of 1812, when their supposedly invincible frigates were repeatedly battered into submission by the heavier, superior American Constitution-class superfrigates. In both cases, a technologically inferior power, on paper, used a specialized, qualitative edge to shatter the confidence of a numerically superior foe. Now fast forward 2 months to October 1942, and the strategic situation on Guadalcanal is hanging by a thread. The center of gravity for the entire campaign is a dirt runway carved out of the jungle by American Marines named Henderson Field. Whoever controls Henderson Field controls the airspace over the southern Solomons during the day. Because the American Cactus Air Force operates from this field, Japanese transport ships cannot approach the island during daylight hours without being bombed into oblivion. So the Japanese logistics train is forced underground, or rather, under the cover of darkness. They stage their forces out of the massive naval base at Rabaul, some 600 miles to the northwest. Using fast destroyers and cruisers, which can make 30 knots or more, they sprint down the Slot, a channel running through the middle of the Solomon Islands chain. They time their runs perfectly, arriving off Guadalcanal around midnight, dumping troops and supplies into landing craft, or simply throwing floating supply drums overboard, bombarding Henderson Field with their deck guns, and then sprinting back up the Slot to get out of American bomber range before the sun rises. This Tokyo Express is a logistical masterpiece, but it is bleeding the American defenders dry. The United States High Command realizes that air power alone cannot stop the Express. The Navy has to go in and fight them on the surface, in the dark, in the very waters where Mikawa had massacred them 2 months prior. The man tasked with this daunting mission is Rear Admiral Norman Scott, commanding Task Force 64. Scott is a methodical, analytical commander, a man who understands that bravery without doctrine is just a fast way to die. He knows the Japanese have better optics and better torpedoes, so he has to find an edge, a way to level the playing field. He finds it in two things: relentless training and a new piece of technology called radar. But how do you integrate a brand new, highly experimental electronic sensor into a fleet that has trained for decades to fight using optical rangefinders and human eyeballs? That is the friction point of this entire battle. Let us break down the opposing forces converging on Cape Esperance, the northernmost tip of Guadalcanal, on the night of October 11th. Steaming down the slot is a Japanese bombardment force commanded by Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto. Goto is a veteran, a man who was present at the Savo Island victory, and he is brimming with the aggressive confidence that characterizes the Imperial Japanese Navy at this stage of the war. His mission is not just to escort a supply convoy, but to take his heavy cruisers and pound Henderson Field into dust with 8-inch high-explosive shells. Goto commands Cruiser Division 6, consisting of 3 heavy cruisers, the Aoba, which serves as his flagship, the Furutaka, and the Kinugasa. These are formidable warships, heavily armed with 8-inch main batteries and loaded with those deadly long-lance torpedoes. They are escorted by 2 fleet destroyers, the Fubuki and the Hatsuyuki. Goto's force is highly trained in night combat, operating under a doctrine that emphasizes stealth, the preemptive torpedo strike, and rapid, chaotic melee combat. They do not rely on radar, they rely on those massive binoculars and the highly trained eyes of their lookouts, men who have been selected for their exceptional night vision. On the American side, Admiral Scott has assembled Task Force 64, a mixed bag of cruisers and destroyers that he has been drilling relentlessly for 3 weeks. Scott's force consists of 4 cruisers. The flagship is the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco, a veteran ship armed with 9 8-inch guns. He also has the heavy cruiser USS Salt Lake City, an older vessel with 10 8-inch guns. But the real firepower, the true meat grinders of this fleet, are the 2 light cruisers, the USS Boise and the USS Helena. Do not let the term light cruiser fool you. While they carry smaller 6-inch guns, they carry 15 of them each, and they can fire them at a staggering rate. They are essentially armoured machine guns of the sea, capable of smothering a target in a deluge of high-explosive steel. Accompanying the cruisers are 5 destroyers, the Fahrenholt, Duncan, Buchanan, McCalla, and Laffey. On paper, Scott has a heavier broadside than Goto, but naval battles in the dark are rarely decided by raw tonnage. They are decided by situational awareness, by who sees who first. And this brings us to the technological trump card, the American radar. But radar in 1942 is not the omniscient, glowing green screen you see in modern movies. It is a finicky, primitive technology, and more importantly, there are different types of radar spread unevenly across Scott's fleet. The flagship, the San Francisco, is equipped with the older SC radar. This is a metric wavelength system with a massive bedspring-style antenna. It is decent at spotting high-flying aircraft, but it is practically useless for surface search among the islands. The radar waves bounce off the land masses of Guadalcanal and Savo Island, creating a chaotic mess of static on the operator's screen known as ground clutter. However, the light cruisers, Helena and Boise, are equipped with the brand new SG radar. This is a game changer. The SG is a centimetric microwave radar. Its shorter wavelength allows it to cut through the ground clutter, distinguishing between an island and a moving warship with remarkable clarity. Furthermore, the SG radar features a plan position indicator, or PPI scope, a circular screen that gives the operator a top-down, map-like view of the battle space, showing range and bearing simultaneously. The older SC radar only uses an A-scope, a simple oscilloscope line with spikes indicating a target, requiring complex math to figure out exactly where the enemy is. So, we have a critical command and control problem. The admiral in charge of the fleet is on a ship that is essentially blind in the dark, while his subordinate ships possess a technological god's-eye view of the ocean. Would you trust a frantic radio report from a junior officer on another ship telling you there are blips on a screen? Or would you trust your own lookouts staring into the blackness? This is the exact dilemma that leads to the chaos of the Battle of Jutland in 1916, where British dreadnoughts stumbled into the German high seas fleet in the dark, unable to tell friend from foe, resulting in devastating friendly fire and missed opportunities. Admiral Scott is terrified of a Jutland-style friendly fire incident. He knows his ships are a mix of different classes, with varying turning radiuses and speeds. To maintain control in the dark, he mandates a strict linear formation. A column of ships, one behind the other, steaming in a single line ahead. 3 destroyers in the van, followed by the 4 cruisers, with 2 more destroyers bringing up the rear. It is a rigid, almost archaic formation, reminiscent of the age of sail, but Scott believes it is the only way to keep his ships from shooting each other when the shooting starts. His battle plan is simple. He intends to patrol back and forth across the western entrance to Ironbottom Sound, effectively capping the T of any Japanese force coming down the slot. Capping the T is the holy grail of naval tactics, allowing a defending line of ships to bring all their broadside guns to bear on an approaching enemy column, while the enemy can only fire their forward-facing guns. It is a brilliant plan in theory, but as the old military adage goes, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. As the sun sets on October 11th, the tropical heat gives way to a humid, oppressive darkness. The sea state is relatively calm, but the sky is overcast, hiding the moon and stars. Visibility is dropping to near zero. Admiral Goto's force is rushing south at 30 knots, his crews at battle stations, confident they will catch the Americans sleeping. Admiral Scott's Task Force 64 is moving into position, a long steel snake carving through the black water. Radio silence in effect, the men speaking in hushed tones as they wait for the inevitable. Deep in the Combat Information Center of the USS Helena, a radar operator stares intently at the glowing amber sweep of the new SG radar scope. The sweep arm rotates, painting the geography of Cape Esperance and Savo Island. Then, a new set of blips appears on the edge of the screen. They are not islands. They are moving fast, coming right down the throat of the slot. The technological trap is set. The two forces are on a collision course. But in the confusion of the night, the line between hunter and hunted is about to blur completely. At 23:25 hours, the glowing amber sweep of the SG radar scope on the light cruiser USS Helena paints a cluster of distinct, undeniable contacts just 27,000 yards away, closing fast at 30 knots. This is the moment the technological advantage shifts, but having the data and acting on it are two entirely different animals in naval warfare. To understand the friction of this moment, you have to look at the communication technology of 1942, specifically the Talk Between Ships radio system, or TBS. This was a very high-frequency radio network designed for secure, line-of-sight voice communication between vessels, meant to replace the slow and highly visible use of flashing signal lamps or signal flags. However, the TBS was notoriously temperamental, prone to static, and on this night, the channel is cluttered with undisciplined chatter and overlapping transmissions. Captain Gilbert Hoover of the Helena sees the enemy on his radar, but his fleet commander, Admiral Scott on the San Francisco, is operating blind with his older, ineffective SC radar. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see, when the very tools designed to help you are actively working against your own command structure? Hoover radios Scott, reporting the contacts, but the transmission is garbled, and Scott, inherently distrustful of this new electronic witchcraft, believes the Helena is just reading ghost echoes bouncing off the shoreline of Savo Island. This command paralysis mirrors the technological growing pains seen during the American Civil War, specifically the introduction of the rifled musket. In the 1860s, officers trained in smoothbore tactics refused to believe their infantry could accurately kill at 300 yards, leading them to march men in tight Napoleonic formations right into the meat grinder of entrenched rifled fire at places like Gettysburg and Fredericksburg. Commanders simply do not trust new technology until they see it draw blood. While Scott debates the validity of the radar contacts, he realizes his patrol line is nearing the edge of his designated operational box, and at 23:30 hours, he orders a column movement to reverse course. This maneuver requires each ship to turn in sequence, following the wake of the vessel ahead of it, a simple evolution in daylight, but a logistical nightmare in pitch darkness. The three Vanguard destroyers, the Fahrenholt, Duncan and Laffey, commanded by Captain Robert Tobin, initiate the turn, but they misjudge the turning radius of the heavy cruisers behind them. Suddenly, Tobin's destroyers are out of position, accelerating to 35 knots, their turbine engines screaming, desperately trying to get back to the head of the American line. They are now running parallel to Scott's cruisers, essentially placing themselves right in the no man's land between the American guns and the incoming Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese flagship Aoba, Admiral Aritomo Goto is standing on the bridge, peering into a humid 80-degree Fahrenheit darkness that is absolute and suffocating. His highly trained lookouts, using their massive 20-power by 120mm binoculars, spot silhouettes on the horizon at 23:43 hours. But Goto makes a fatal, albeit logical, assumption based on the rigid Japanese operational timetable. He knows that a separate Japanese reinforcement group, commanded by Admiral Takatsugu Jojima, is operating in this exact same patch of ocean, tasked with dropping off troops and supplies on the beaches of Guadalcanal. Goto looks at the dark shapes and assumes they are Jojima's transport ships. Would you hold your fire, risking the survival of your own ship, just to confirm a silhouette in the pitch black of a Pacific night? This exact type of deadly misidentification happened to Confederate General Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville in 1863, when he rode out ahead of his lines in the dark and was mortally wounded by a volley from his own North Carolina infantry, who mistook his staff for Union cavalry. Fog of war is not just a concept, it is a physical, psychological barrier that kills even the most seasoned commanders. Back on the American side, the Helena has had enough of waiting. At 23:46 hours, Captain Hoover gets on the TBS radio and transmits the phrase, "Interrogatory, Roger." In standard naval parlance of the time, this was a request for permission to commence firing. Admiral Scott, still confused about the radar contacts and worried about his out-of-position destroyers, replies with a simple, "Roger." Scott meant, "Message received, I hear you." Hoover takes it as, "Permission granted, open fire." This is the complete inverse of Commodore George Dewey's famous calm order at the Battle of Manila Bay in 1898, where he clearly stated, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." Here at Cape Esperance, the opening of the battle is triggered by a catastrophic misunderstanding of a single word. But once the trigger is pulled, the sheer volume of American firepower unleashed is apocalyptic. The Helena and the Boise, the two light cruisers, open up with their main batteries. We need to dissect the mechanical terror of the 6-inch 47 caliber Mark 16 naval gun, because it is the undisputed star of this engagement. Each of these cruisers carries 15 of these guns in 5 triple turrets. Unlike heavy cruiser guns, which require tedious manual loading of massive powder bags, the Mark 16 uses a semi-automatic hoist system that rams a 105-pound high-capacity shell and a brass powder casing into the breech at a terrifying speed. A well-drilled crew can fire 10 rounds per minute per barrel. Do the math on that. Between the two light cruisers, they are pumping 300 high-explosive shells into the air every 60 seconds. The night is instantly shattered by blinding, continuous sheets of yellow and orange flame. The American cruisers are using flashless powder, a recent chemical innovation designed to reduce the blinding effect on their own optical rangefinders, but the sheer volume of fire still turns the ocean into a strobe-lit theatre of violence. Admiral Scott has accidentally achieved the tactical dream. He has capped the Japanese T. His entire battle line is perpendicular to the approaching Japanese column, meaning every single American ship can bring its full broadside to bear, while the Japanese ships are masking each other's fire and can only shoot forward. Aboard the Aoba, the incoming fire looks like a solid wall of red-hot steel arcing through the night sky. The first American salvos bracket the Japanese flagship, sending massive geysers of white water into the air, and then the steel finds meat. Dozens of 105-pound shells from the light cruisers and massive 260-pound armor-piercing shells from the heavy cruisers San Francisco and Salt Lake City slam into the Aoba's superstructure. The impact of a naval shell is a localized earthquake. When an 8-inch high-explosive shell detonates against unarmored steel plating, it does not just punch a hole, it creates a massive overpressure wave that liquefies human organs, while transforming the ship's own bulkheads into thousands of jagged, supersonic shrapnel blades. Admiral Goto, still convinced he is being fired upon by his own countrymen, desperately orders his signalman to flash the ship's recognition lights. He screams, "I am Aoba! I am Aoba!" into the chaotic night. His answer is a direct hit on the Aoba's bridge by an 8-inch shell from the San Francisco. The detonation vaporizes the command staff and leaves Admiral Goto mortally wounded, his legs shattered, bleeding out on the deck of his ruined flagship. The Aoba is burning fiercely, her communication arrays destroyed, 2 of her main gun turrets knocked out, and her hull riddled with holes. She begins a desperate hard turn to starboard to escape the slaughter, laying down a thick smokescreen to hide her agony. But the American fire is not just hitting the Japanese. Remember those 3 American destroyers that got lost during the column turn? They are now caught directly in the crossfire of their own fleet. The destroyer USS Duncan, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Edmund Taylor, suddenly finds itself silhouetted by the burning Aoba. Taylor, seeing the Japanese flagship, does what destroyer captains are bred to do. He charges. He orders flank speed, pushing his 2,000-ton tin can toward the massive heavy cruiser, intending to launch a spread of torpedoes. But in the darkness and the smoke, the gunners on the American cruisers see a shadowy profile moving aggressively, and they assume it is Japanese. The Duncan is hammered by friendly fire from the San Francisco and simultaneously targeted by the secondary batteries of the Japanese cruisers. Shells tear through the Duncan's thin steel skin, destroying her forward fire room, severing her steam lines, and turning her interior into a scalding high-pressure steam oven that cooks men alive at over 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The Fahrenheit is also hit by friendly fire, taking a 6-inch shell through her torpedo tube mount, but she manages to limp out of the direct line of fire. Admiral Scott, suddenly realizing his destroyers are being massacred by his own guns, panics and orders a general ceasefire at 23:47 hours, just minutes after the engagement began. He gets on the TBS radio, desperately trying to re-establish control, shouting for his ships to stop shooting. Captain Hoover, on the Helena, watching the Japanese flee on his radar screen, is furious, but he complies with the order. For 4 agonizing minutes, the guns fall silent. The only sounds, the roaring fires on the Aoba and the hissing steam of the dying Duncan. Have you ever seen a prize fighter get knocked down in the first round, only to shake off the blood, bite down on his mouthpiece, and come back swinging with lethal intent? That is exactly what the Imperial Japanese Navy is about to do. They may have been caught by surprise, they may have lost their commander, but they still possess the deadliest weapon in the Pacific theater, and they are not about to retreat without using it. While the Aoba limps away, the heavy cruiser Furutaka, commanded by Captain Araki Tsuto, makes a selfless, suicidal maneuver. Tsuto sees his flagship burning and intentionally steers his cruiser directly between the Aoba and the American battle line, deliberately drawing the American radar locks and the optical rangefinders onto his own ship. Simultaneously, the heavy cruiser Kinugasa and the destroyer Fubuki peel off into the darkness, calculating firing solutions, flooding their torpedo tubes, and preparing to unleash a swarm of oxygen-fueled long lances into the confused, static American formation. At 23:51 hours, Admiral Scott finally realizes his cruisers are not firing at his own out-of-position destroyers, but at the main body of the Japanese fleet. He lifts the ceasefire order, and the American line erupts once again into a blinding tempest of flashless powder and high-explosive steel. The Japanese heavy cruiser Furutaka, having bravely thrust herself into the crossfire to shield the fleeing flagship Aoba, absorbs the full wrath of Task Force 64. The Furutaka is a 10,000-ton warship, but against the combined broadsides of 2 heavy and 2 light American cruisers, her armor is utterly inadequate. Within a span of 3 minutes, she is struck by over 90 heavy-caliber shells. Her oxygen torpedo tubes, fully loaded and primed for launch, are struck by shrapnel and detonate, turning her midships into a roaring, uncontrollable inferno. The Furutaka loses all power, her steering gear is jammed, and she begins to sink by the stern into the black waters of Ironbottom Sound. At the same time, the Japanese destroyer Fubuki, caught completely out of position and silhouetted by the burning cruisers, is ripped apart by rapid-fire 6-inch shells from the San Francisco and the Boise. The Fubuki capsizes and sinks in a matter of minutes, taking most of her crew into the depths. But the Imperial Japanese Navy is not broken, and they are masters of the counterpunch. The heavy cruiser Kinugasa, completely untouched in the initial American barrage, executes a flawless tactical pivot. Her commander, Captain Masao Sawa, uses the blazing wrecks of the Furutaka and the Aoba as a smokescreen, maneuvering his ship into a firing position while his torpedo crews unleash a spread of the deadly 24-inch long lance torpedoes. By a miracle of naval geometry, the torpedoes pass harmlessly through the American line, some missing the keels of the American ships by mere feet. But the Kinugasa's 8-inch main battery does not miss. Captain Sawa targets the most active American ship, the light cruiser USS Boise, which has been firing her 15 6-inch guns so continuously that her barrels are glowing cherry red in the dark. At 0011 hours, a massive 260-pound armor-piercing shell from the Kinugasa strikes the Boise just below the waterline, penetrating her forward magazine. This is the ultimate nightmare scenario for any warship. When a magazine detonates, the ship usually ceases to exist in a fraction of a second. We saw this exact catastrophic failure when the British battlecruiser HMS Hood was struck by the Bismarck in the Denmark Strait, instantly vaporizing the ship and killing over 1,400 men. We saw it at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, where 3 British battlecruisers were blown out of the water because their cordite handling procedures allowed flash fires to reach the magazines. But the USS Boise does not explode. Why does this American cruiser survive a direct hit to its powder room? It comes down to a grim, ruthless application of American damage control doctrine. As the fire rages toward the tons of high explosives stored in the forward hull, the ocean itself rushes in through the massive hole torn by the Japanese shell. The flooding water battles the raging chemical fire. In the lower handling rooms, American sailors, knowing they are trapped and doomed, manually open the flood valves to accelerate the sinking of their own compartments, drowning themselves to ensure the fire cannot reach the powder bags. Over 100 American sailors die in the forward sections of the Boise, but their ultimate sacrifice saves the ship from total annihilation. Seeing the Boise burning and crippled, her forward guns silenced, and her hull taking on thousands of tons of water, Captain Ernest Small of the heavy cruiser USS Salt Lake City makes a command decision that defines the ethos of the United States Navy. He breaks formation, steering his older, slower heavy cruiser directly between the wounded Boise and the firing Kinugasa. The Salt Lake City absorbs the incoming Japanese fire, using her 10 8-inch guns to hammer back at the Kinugasa, eventually forcing the Japanese cruiser to break off the engagement and retreat into the blackness of the slot. By 0040 hours, the guns fall silent, and the Battle of Cape Esperance is over. Admiral Scott gathers his battered task force and limps back toward the safety of the American base at Espiritu Santo. The American destroyer Duncan, hopelessly riddled with friendly and enemy fire, finally sinks the following afternoon. The Japanese have lost the heavy cruiser Furutaka and the destroyer Fubuki, and the flagship Aoba is severely damaged. On paper, it is a clear tactical victory for the United States Navy, as they have met the masters of night combat in their own element and forced them to retreat. But when we strip away the wartime propaganda and analyze the battle through a cold, strategic lens, a much more complex picture emerges. The tactical victory at Cape Esperance was largely an illusion, masking deep systemic flaws in the American approach to naval warfare. First, the integration of radar was a complete failure. Having the most advanced technology in the world is useless if your command structure does not trust it or know how to use it. Admiral Scott's insistence on a rigid, single-file column formation, combined with his distrust of the SG radar on the Helena, nearly resulted in a catastrophic defeat. His formation restricted the maneuverability of his ships and led directly to the friendly fire incident that doomed the destroyer Duncan. This is a classic military blunder, akin to the early days of the American Civil War, where Union generals like George McClellan possessed massive logistical and technological advantages, but were paralyzed by a rigid adherence to outdated European doctrines, allowing a more aggressive, adaptable Confederate army to run rings around them. Technology only wins wars when military doctrine evolves to match it. Furthermore, we must look at the multidimensional logistical reality of the Tokyo Express. While Admiral Scott and Admiral Goto were blasting each other to pieces in Ironbottom Sound, the actual strategic objective of the Japanese operation was achieved completely unhindered. Admiral Takatsugu Jojima's transport group, operating just a few miles away, successfully unloaded thousands of fresh Japanese infantrymen, heavy artillery pieces, and vital supplies onto the beaches of Guadalcanal. In the grand chessboard of the Pacific War, Goto's bombardment force was merely a pawn, sacrificed to ensure the safe delivery of the logistical payload. The Americans won the firefight, but the Japanese won the logistical mission. This dynamic is eerily similar to the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War, where American forces won every major tactical engagement and inflicted massive casualties on the enemy, but the sheer scale of the offensive allowed the enemy to shift the strategic and political momentum permanently. Winning the battle does not always mean winning the objective. However, in a war of industrial economics, Cape Esperance revealed a fatal flaw in the Japanese war machine. The United States could afford to have the USS Boise heavily damaged. They simply sailed her back to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, where the massive, untouched American industrial base repaired her, upgraded her, and sent her back to the fleet in a matter of months. The Japanese, on the other hand, could not easily replace a 10,000-ton heavy cruiser like the Furutaka. Their shipyards were already straining under the demands of a multi-front war, and their access to raw materials was slowly being strangled by American submarines. The loss of a single heavy combatant was a permanent reduction in Japanese naval power. This is the brutal math of total war. It is not just about who has the better tactics on a given night. It is about who can absorb horrific losses and still put a fleet to sea the next morning. The Battle of Cape Esperance was a messy, confused, and bloody brawl, defined by friendly fire, communication breakdowns, and the terrifying chaos of night combat. But for the United States Navy, it was an absolutely vital psychological turning point. After the massacre at Savo Island, American sailors needed to know that the Imperial Japanese Navy could bleed, that their guns could hit the target, and that their ships could take a punch. Cape Esperance provided that grim reassurance, serving as the bloody tuition the United States Navy had to pay to learn how to fight in the dark. In the brutal calculus of war, survival often belongs not to the army with the perfect plan, but to the military that can adapt the fastest when that plan inevitably disintegrates into chaos. The true measure of a fighting force is how it bleeds, how it learns, and how it strikes back. What do you think was the most critical factor in the American survival at Cape Esperance? A. The introduction of the SG microwave radar. B. The sheer volume of fire from the light cruisers. Or C. The heroic damage control efforts of the American sailors. Let me know your choice and your reasoning in the comments below.